Good morning. Thank you all for coming. It's a little early for many of you who've traveled far. Some of you came from very long distances. We have the honor of having a number of people here from Chongji University in China. And we have a number of people from the eastern part of the United States as well as the rest of the United States as well. My name is Stephen Mahin. I am the previous director of the Pacific Earthquake Engineering Research Center. And I would like to welcome you on behalf of the institutional board and the staff up here and certainly the University of California at Berkeley. For those of you who don't know this, we're about 150 feet from the Hayward Fault, so we'll be up really close and comfortable, I guess, if we should have an earthquake on the Hayward Fault. So what I wanted to do today was to welcome you and to maybe give a little bit of a background as to what PEER has been doing as a context for what we hope to do over the next couple of days. Basically, we have an annual meeting every year for the most part, and this was supposed to be in 2015, but for a variety of reasons it sort of slipped over the New Year's into the beginning of 2016. But our intent is to have annual meetings for everyone to share ideas and discuss ideas for new research and opportunities for improving the resilience of structures and communities. Over the last 6 or 7 years, over the last decade and a half, we've been having an annual meeting. And this has been true over the last 6 or 7 years. And when I became director of PEER, we had this great idea of partnering with other organizations. So the first year we had a meeting where we jointly did it with the International Association of Experimental Structural Engineering, and the next year with NIST. And then we decided that just having a really big meeting didn't give us a really good chance to talk and decide what we were going to do. So we basically had some meetings where it were some plenary sessions combined with a lot of breakout sessions looking at new areas that we might pursue. Then we took the approach that an old earthquake is too good of an opportunity to pass up. And so we had the anniversaries of the Northridge earthquake and the Loma Prieta earthquake. And so we organized the Northridge 28 conference. We had more than 700 people attend down at UCLA. And we had then the Loma Prieta earthquake commemoration on the 25th anniversary, which we did in conjunction with the Association of Bay Area Governments and other organizations in that year, a year ago, October. And so basically those meetings also became very interesting. We were an opportunity to reflect on what we've accomplished in the last decade or 2 or 3. And what are the remaining gaps we needed to address, but we didn't have a chance to talk about that. And so today, I'm hoping, and the organizing committee for this session, this meeting, are hoping that this will give us an opportunity to look at some of the things that we've learned over the last 5 or so years, and then see what kind of opportunities there might be moving forward, and what kinds of interests we have in pursuing those kinds of things. For those of you who are not familiar with PEER, I thought I'd give a few words of introduction. PEER is a consortium of universities, industry, and industrial partners, headquartered here in Berkeley, but it is also comprised of 9 other core universities on the western part of the United States. It is not just those universities, but in California we have many more partner universities, and across the United States we also have many more as well, and we have several internationally. We are fortunate to have a number of very good and generous sponsors for the most part, and we have a large number of industrial and business partners that we're proud to work with. The goals of PEER are to advance and apply performance-based earthquake engineering concepts. We're trying to focus those not on what an individual person could do, but rather on solving challenging societal problems through multi-investigator, multi-institutional research built on a foundation of solid science and engineering. That's being done in close partnership with our industry and government and academic academic partners, and especially we are proud to work with people all over the United States and all over the world. Given that we are university-based, education is a really key component of everything that we do, and it infuses how we think about things as well as our dedication to incorporating students and postdocs and others into our research programs. Holding all of this together is the peer methodology for performance-based earthquake engineering that was put together a long time ago by a number of peer-related researchers and put into action in the NSF-sponsored Pacific Earthquake Engineering Research Center that NSF funded for a decade. That is good because it's based on solid reliability concepts. And it also is a method of an engineer dividing a problem up into its component parts so that every person working on it can address those parts individually, but feel that they are and actually do contribute to the greater whole of those. And so we have our triple integral, but each of those boxes has many subcomponents which have to be done. And this framework allows us to all work together, focusing on what we're most interested in, but working as part of a bigger team, but to try to solve problems in terms of categorizing the risk associated with the hazards that we're looking at, but also looking at things in interest to various stakeholders, such as downtime, business interruption, losses, repair costs, and maybe carbon footprint and casualties, and other things like that. So that's been focused mainly on individual facilities, and today and tomorrow we'd like to talk a little bit more about extending that out from an individual structure to systems, and lifelines, and independent lifelines, and to communities as well. So the first box in the peer methodology is to look at hazards. So starting with earthquakes, we have been doing for many years now a program called NGA, which I think just now stands like NGA, it's sort of like the actor, rather singer Prince, known by a symbol. But NGA was next generation attenuation, but I don't think that's a term that is in vogue anymore. So we're keeping the name as NGA, but what it means may stand for something else. In that work, we have brought together a very diverse group of scientists in the earth sciences, social sciences, engineering, seismology, and so on, to address what are the likely hazards that you would have at a particular site that engineers should consider in design. That started out focusing on the western part of the United States, where we looked at active crustal earthquakes. And while this is applicable to California and many other parts of the West or the United States, it's also applicable to Turkey and some parts of Taiwan and so on. And so we've been calling that NGA West. That sort of offended many people. On the eastern part of the United States, we weren't being fair, and so we have a large NGA East program right at the moment, and that is looking at the information we have available there and coming up with similar guidelines for what the ground motions might be for a given earthquake and location. But that information is also applicable to much of Europe and Africa and so on. And then that leaves out a quadrant of the United States, which is the Pacific Northwest and Alaska. And so we have now ongoing a project which is related to subduction zone regions, which would also include Northern California, Oregon, Washington, Alaska, but also Japan, Chile, Peru, and much of the Pacific Rim, like that. Basically, as part of our work, we've been developing very large databases of empirical, but also simulated earthquake ground motions. The databases are all public and easily accessible for designers and researchers, as well as others who are interested in getting actual recorded ground motions that have been uniformly processed and well documented. And the work that we do is highly collaborative, based on a team approach rather than having people do things their own way without at least developing some type of consensus. So basically, the NGA West 2 project. The second phase of that was completed in 2014. It resulted in 5 sets of relationships for how to predict earthquake ground motions and use spectra at particular locations in the crustal area of western United States. And those have all been adopted by USGS in developing the new maps for seismic hazards in the United States. This is basically now affecting every building designed and retrofit in the western part of the United States, and we will hopefully be helping design more resilient structures in the eastern part of the United States soon. One of the benefits of this is now we have processed more than 20,000 records, and these are all on that database, and there's more than 63,000 actual individual records through 21,000 sites. And this is basically increasing over the last 6 or so years the size of this database by a factor of 6. So the NGA group has been quite busy. On the eastern part of the United States, we're doing very similar things. And here, the sponsors are mainly organizations interested in power, and nuclear power in particular, as well as USGS. And so we are pursuing that, and most of the work has been completed. There are a large number of reports that have been put together on that. A summary report is going to be published in about a month or 2 as a NRC reg guide. And so as part of that NGA East project, we have more than 50 people involved in developing those recommendations. So now, what are we doing? And so the NGA East project is coming to an end until we get another earthquake and have more data. But what we're trying to do now is look at subduction zone earthquakes, which have had devastating effects in Chile and Japan and potentially the Pacific Northwest. And so this is funded by Caltrans for the Pacific, the northern part of California, USGS and FM Global. And basically what we have been doing is gathering up that information, and I understand there's more than 100,000 individual sites that have been put into the database for that. So there's something over 300,000 or so individual records that are being processed there. The success of the NGA program is basically the heart of what PEER is doing, and that is the technical coordination is done by PEER, but it is a community-based consensus building process made up of academics and other researchers, practitioners, as well as government officials and some other stakeholders as well. But we do this through an open and transparent consensus building process based on the best science available at the time. So, earthquake shaking is something we've all been worried about for a long time. And basically, what we have done is looked at other hazards. And multi-hazard engineering is now sort of a key word in many circles. And so we decided to sort of branch out from our earthquake origins and go on to tsunamis. And so we started about 5 years ago a fledgling tsunami engineering research group, and there are going to be 3 sessions, I think, in this meeting that will highlight some of their work. But what we try to do is to move the notion of tsunami engineering to something that was based on our PEER methodology and probabilistic and risk-based assessment. And so we have been doing maps early on of probabilistic hazards. This is now, as a methodology, been adopted by various other groups, and we're proud of that. We were able to develop probabilistic inundation maps, just like you would have probabilistic ground shaking maps. And in California, where much of our current funding has been coming from, the hazards are not as great as in other places of the world. But even so, in Southern California and in Northern California, there are many things really close to the sea that are not at very high elevations. And so there's some potential here for some risk, and categorizing that and figuring out what to do would be important. To do that, the tsunami engineering research group has been developing the foundations for performance-based tsunami engineering, and you'll hear more about those later today. in sessions that will look at a number of things, but we also now have a tsunami database, much like the NGA database, and we have a big project from FHWA and a number of the state DOTs looking at the guidelines for design of tsunamis and analysis of bridges to resist, not design of tsunamis, but design and analysis of bridges to resist tsunamis, like that. Moving on, in terms of hazards related to earthquakes, then we also started a nascent program on fire following earthquakes, looking at some of the potentials for urban fires associated with gas line breaks and fires in tall buildings. We had about a year ago in October a workshop on fire following earthquakes that was oriented primarily to first responders. And we have been doing a lot of work on putting in emergency water, high pressure water lines that you could fight fires, such as the one that happened in the Marina District in San Francisco in 1989, where the water system went out and we needed to get water to fight the fires in them. So if you're interested in that, please see Charlie Cauffman or Professor Moselon about their interest in that. So that's sort of the hazard side of it. Then we have to apply performance-based earthquake engineering, and we've been doing that in relation to buildings, transportation systems, and other lifeline systems. And so there's a variety of applications related to buildings, both new and existing. One of the highlights of these activities is the Tall Building Initiative, which has got a number of awards for the work that was done there. Most recent was in December, where we got a team that put this together, got an award for exceptional public and private sector research and development programs by ATC and SEI, and we're very proud of that group and of this award. Now, I tried to get money as peer director to continue that work in the middle of the recession, which was not necessarily good, and people thought that nobody would ever build a high-rise building again, and so why fund any research on it? So we realized that there were many existing buildings that could potentially pose hazards, and so if you just look at the panoramic views of Los Angeles or San Francisco, San Diego, Sacramento, Oakland, you'll see a lot of tall buildings. And it turns out that there's more than 220 tall buildings, more than 20 stories tall, that were built between World War II and around 1990. And so whether those pose a significant seismic risk is a question that we posed. And we started the the Tall Building Initiative Part 2 program, which then looked at an inventory of those buildings, assessing methods and criteria that one might use to evaluate them, characterize earthquake hazards in a couple of locations, analyzed some case study buildings, did some cost assessments of the retrofits and likely damage that they would have, and looked at some discussions of these issues with practitioners and others. So we held a number of workshops shown here in this photo, and we may be working on an extension of this work to develop guidelines. But basically, these buildings were designed before drift limits were imposed on buildings. The design forces were roughly a fifth of what they would be now. There was no concern at all for strong column, weak girder design, capacity design, and ductility for the most part. And so it's not unusual that these buildings would pose some hazard, and this is the results that would be out as soon as we get it back from the printer, of a building, a real building in San Francisco, to what would be the MCE level event, suggesting that the black line here is the existing as-built structure, and then what we did was look at several retrofits to try to reduce the risk and assess then the costs of reducing that risk and see what could be done there. So there's a lot of work that can be done there. We also looked at bridge systems, and there's going to be some sessions on that, so I won't say too much here, but this is sort of looking at accelerated bridge construction, new technologies, not so much on retrofit anymore, but some ideas of performance-based earthquake engineering and applying that to bridge engineering in a more direct way. We've also been looking at lifeline systems, especially electrical power distribution systems, and we have a few programs on that, looking at nuclear energy facilities, as well as fuel storage facilities. And so there's some work on that that I think we will talk at this meeting about. Holding all of that together and empowering it is the Open Seas platform for earthquake engineering simulation. This is now fully operable and parallel processing. We have students who are running thousands and thousands of processors on a number of high-performance computing centers provided by NSF, and doing work that has not been possible before. And this is also up on Amazon Cloud Services, Web Services, I guess is the correct term. All right, so we have that. Now, we've been working on individual buildings, but over the last decade, I think it's come to everyone's attention that even moderate damage in an individual building, when extrapolated over a whole community, can have really disastrous or catastrophic effects. And we've seen that in Wenchuan and New Zealand, and in hurricane terms in New Orleans, like that. And so the question that some people have been asking, or many people now are asking, is whether or not designing for life safety is adequate, and whether or not the idea of performance-based design should be made more proactive to find solutions where we might have more resilient structures moving forward. And so we might then redefine the design goals for earthquake engineering such that we still have to protect life safety. We need, for the owner's sake, to have economical structures. We need, for the community's sake, to have buildings be constructed quickly with minimal disruption, noise, and so on to the public, as well as damage to the environment. But that really cities and community, as well as the occupants and owners of buildings, really want the building to withstand strong earthquakes and other hazards, not just safely, but with little disruption and cost associated with post-earthquake inspections and repairs. And so that's sort of consistent with green building concepts, sustainable design, but certainly resilient-based design. And so the title and subtitle of this meeting are basically decision-making in the face of uncertainty. So how can we use performance-based earthquake engineering? And then if we can address how one designs to account for uncertainty in a very deliberate way, can we deliberately use that idea to design more resilient systems that are both able to be occupied and restored to function rapidly after an earthquake, but also economically. So we have a challenge of coming up with a new generation of structural systems that are safe, economical, and able to function rapidly after a natural disaster. So we have a number of education programs. I'm running out of time here, so I have a number of education programs that we're very proud of, and these are continuing. Greater support is needed, as always. If you're interested in these and other activities, please talk to any of the speakers or to Professor Mosalon. And look at the Peer website, keep up on track on what is going on. You'll notice on here, if you are new to Peer, that there's a little button that says subscribe, or see Grace Kang, and she will put you in contact with the appropriate people to get you on the mailing list and be alerted to what is going on. All right, that's what I have. Does anybody have any questions about the program or what I said? All right, so let's move on to the next session, and can you help me figure out where the slides are here? Is this? No, that's great. All right. So the next session is really what I just said, which was how do we use our methodologies, our capabilities to design for resilience with intent. And so we have a number of speakers who will be joining us, looking at sort of giving us an overall framework framework, looking at what is being done at the national level, what is being done at the state level, and what kinds of ideas are being implemented in research. And so while my colleagues are trying to figure out the IT side of it, let me introduce the first speaker who will be joining us on the stage, Mary Comerio, who's been one of the key proponents of peer methodology and performance-based earthquake engineering. She's the current president of PRI and has been a distinguished member of the institutional board of peer and a more distinguished researcher in the peer program. Mary?
Good morning, everyone, and I am very pleased always to be part of the peer annual meeting. And I have to say that I talked about resilience, only with the word resilience in the title, 5 years ago at the peer annual meeting. And at that time, we spent a lot of time just outlining the definition of what it meant. We hadn't really, oh gosh, I forgot. I'm supposed to turn this on. What am I supposed to do? This is hard. Okay, now we're going to try this again. In 2011, I spent some time just defining what the sort of social science research was, what people were doing around the ideas of resilience. And so this morning I'm going to talk about sort of where we've come in the last 5 years, and to provide some examples of how sort of engineering has adapted, really integrating some of these social resilience methods into a sort of performance-based way of thinking, and also kind of advancing risk modeling. And then, briefly talk about some future work for peer researchers. So to go back, one slide from 5 years ago, I talked about two paradigms of resilience. The engineering resilience focusing on the kind of traditional notion of sort of efficiency, constancy, predictability, the definition of sort of stability as an equilibrium or a steady state, versus a kind of ecological paradigm which focuses on more persistence and change and adaptability. And it is sort of this ecological concept that's been really adapted into a more contemporary way of thinking. Now, when you hear Laurie Johnson, she's going to tell you there's a third paradigm, but I'm not going to steal her thunder. So I'll let her talk to you about this third paradigm that is really emerging, and it really comes out of this sort of, really the combination of these two concepts. We really often talk about urban systems because resilience is particularly difficult in urban systems where you have so many complex things coming together. And one of the things that has come about is the support from the Rockefeller Foundation for a program called the 100 Resilient Cities. And they have made a definition, which is not like everybody else's, is similar to everyone else's. It's this capacity to survive, adapt, grow, deal with whatever kind of chronic stress or acute shock they experience, and move on, and to continue to function, not to collapse. This diagram, which you can't read, and I won't even try, it's got 150 different variables. It's a very complex thing, but the dimensions are essentially social, economic, institutional, infrastructure, ecological, community dimensions, including schools and education and hospitals and all of the things that it takes to make life function within an urban system. So this is really being adapted not only in our area of work, but by cities around the globe, by people trying to sort of make cities healthier, make them more sort of adaptable in the face of all kinds of shocks. So even if it's, it's an economic downturn, it doesn't have to be a disaster per se. And so how does this apply? For us, it's a tool. The notion of resilience is a tool. It's valuable for the analysis of systems and policy for sustainable development. We already have performance engineering as a kind of giant step passed sort of prescriptive building codes targeting performance goals. Now, the next step is to really go beyond building and infrastructure design to look at sort of cascading consequences for users and communities. And here's a few examples. Back in 2008, the SPUR, San Francisco Civic Organization, took on a project called their sort of Resilient Cities approach. It was supported with a lot of effort from Chris Poland, one of our colleagues in the professional side in engineering, but it was a huge group of people from developers, real estate professionals, tenants, owners, and they looked at kind of defining the concept of disaster resilience in recovery, estimating performance goals for a 500-year earthquake, defining sort of measures, but the core of it is this simple chart in which you kind of looked at all, it's pages and pages long, but you looked at sort of housing, for example, and you said, well, where are we now in terms of how our housing would perform in the city, and where we want to be? You know, where we are now is that it's going to take more than 3 years to repair all this housing, and we would probably like to be, you know, have housing functioning in more like 3 or 4 months. Well, how do we get there? The reason that housing was so important in San Francisco is because we have a high number of multifamily units. 75% of the housing is multifamily. We have a young workforce that lives in a lot of this rental housing. The fear was if we lose that workforce, we lose sort of the economy of the city, that those companies, those tech companies will leave. Now, some people might think that's a good idea, but that's another story. But the effort here was to really look at what kind of losses there were, and this chart really shows that there was no neighborhood which was not going to have really significant housing units that would be damaged and uninhabitable. And this then brought about a set of goals saying, well, we want to have kind of 95% of our housing to be habitable, or at least be able to shelter in that housing, even if it isn't fully functional, in 30 years. So we want to get from kind of where we are now, which is about 75% habitable or 25% uninhabitable in this 500-year event, to a much higher proportion. That civic effort really led to a series of city efforts establishing lifeline councils, looking at governance, appointing a chief resilience officer, doing financial planning, passing a soft story retrofit ordinance, coordination at the regional and federal levels. All of these things are sort of public efforts. Now, that was a civic effort. How do we then integrate this into a research platform? A while ago, Lucy Jones asked me, from USGS, said to me, how do I get from this arm waving about resilience into something scientific? Well, here are some examples. As with loss modeling, you know, you need, like it has this, you need default data to develop kind of locally specific data and metrics. You can either do the research and get the data, and I mean social data, housing data, healthcare data, whatever. But these metrics, these social metrics, health, housing, employment, economics, they are also data-driven, but they're also very discipline-specific. So they have models. They're not models we are used to using. So we have to link their models and our models. We have to link the sort of social data to the building and infrastructure data to start to really understand these regional impacts and proposed policies. So one example, and Mike Mueller's in the room, this is from his dissertation. Mike, this is the shortest presentation of your dissertation in the face of the earth in 2 slides. So excuse me for making it simplified, but Mike really tried to look at, okay, what if you take one of these social parameters like SPUR has, you know, like, okay, we don't want to have significant out-migration from San Francisco. We don't want people to leave. So you have to then say, what are these community functions? Well, he defined them as housing, public services, employment, and education. And then the second step is to really establish sort of communities-level resilience goals. So, for example, we don't want to have less than 1% out-migration. You know, we don't want to have a lot of out-migration in this event. We want to keep people in the city. How do we do that? And the core of the sort of analytical component is then taking that social performance goal, this goal about housing, and translating it using and a kind of an event tree analysis to see what that would mean. So, for example, if you have a moderate impact event, you have less than 10% of your residents displaced. If you have a significant impact, it's 10 to 20% displaced. If you have a catastrophic event, it's more than 20%. So you can start to then build an event tree that looks at what are the impacts of those things and establish some performance targets for various systems and components. So, you could say you only want residents displaced if they can't shelter in place. And what does that mean? That means the target for the housing stock, when you do this analysis, is that you've got to have about 5% of the housing stock safe to occupy. This then you can apply to building codes, you can apply to retroactive codes, you can develop performance standards for lifelines. It extends PBE another, see that number? How many? Okay, 5 minutes. Okay, that's fine. You can't see without these. You can extend PBEE with another module that looks at sort of social metrics. Now, a different example is to look at risk modeling in a different way. And this is a dissertation by David Lallemont at Stanford, just completed in 2015, where he looked at modeling risk with growth trajectories primarily in developing countries as opposed to our model from Mike that was really aimed at a kind of modern first world city. And in David's work, he said 60% of the population is going to be urban by 2030. We're already more than 50%. And there's an ad hoc process about how urbanization works in most of the world. So in this example, he looks at the sort of dynamic vulnerability of these different housing types. In a developing country, you typically have, a small house built, a 1-story, a 2-story, then you add some more rooms, then you add another story, then you add another story. So over time, you have a different kind of vulnerability for these different expansion states. So what he did was he looked at modeling that vulnerability for all of these different prototypical states and creating a fragility curve associated with each of those different building states. He then reached out to kind of an urban planning model. So he took at one level our classic hazard model, another our fragility model, but looking at it over different points in time. And he built that into an urban growth model. It's called a cellular autonomous model. It's used by planners all the time, where you take this data and you control how growth happens. You understand how growth happens. And so you're modeling the vulnerabilities of these different stages over time. This is just a quick example of how it looks on a map. You see this growth happening in Cape-Haitian. You can take that and combine those models, and you start to look at evolving seismic risk. So you see that if you could, you can't really capture it just by population because of the way this incremental expansion happens, but you can look at changing construction standards just for new construction in the developing world, and then you could reduce risk by 20%. So this is a hugely significant way of thinking about dealing with risk in urban development in underdeveloped countries. It's a really important example of those combinations of models. So to conclude, and there are other examples, Kellen Elwood in New Zealand is doing some very interesting work on looking at how you could look at demolitions vis-a-vis performance-based engineering and sort of cycle that back into some understanding. So I think there's a lot of work being done. And essentially, my message is there are analytic methods that can be developed to build engineering applications for resilient and sustainable cities. We have research opportunities to extend performance-based engineering and risk models to quantify resilience. And this is our next generation performance-based engineering. It's inventory and data-driven, but it's about integrating models from other fields and combining those with our models to really understand the larger community impacts and to feed that back into policy. And I think I managed to stay under 15 minutes.
Thanks, Marianne. What's happening this morning, we're going to have 4 speakers. We'll hold questions. So I would ask everybody in the audience, if you have questions for Mary and the other speakers coming up, jot yourself a note, because if we all stay on track, we'll have about a half hour when we get through for questions and answer discussion with the audience. So I'd next like to welcome up Steve Cauffman, who has dug himself out of the snowy Washington, D.C. area to come here. Steve is heading up the large NIST program on community resilience, which we see they're building some roadmap for communities in the U.S. Also the big Resilience Center of Excellence on some technology. So we're really delighted that Steve could join us today to see kind of what they're doing and to think about the research that we're all doing collectively and how that feeds into the bigger picture in their effort.
Okay, well, good morning, and it's great to be here. As Greg pointed out, I was snowed in until Wednesday, and not through any public efforts, but through a neighbor proving that social connections are important. We got dug out, and I was able to get to the airport yesterday. Before I kind of jump in, I want to thank Mary for setting this up beautifully. She gave a nice history of some of the things that have been going on in resilience since 2011, and I hope that I build on a lot of the work that she described. So let me briefly jump into why we even are thinking about resilience. Every community, regardless of its location, faces potential disruption from hazards, whether they be natural, technological, or human caused. And as we all know, those hazards take a very high toll in lives, livelihoods, and quality of life. And we can reduce that toll by better managing disaster risks. And I think Mary pointed out very nicely that communities are really socio-technical systems. Buildings and infrastructure enable the social and economic functions that are really the lifeblood of all of our communities. And it's really those social and economic needs that should drive the goals for how buildings and infrastructure perform. And it is possible to prioritize, or plan and implement prioritized measures to build resilience and improve a community's ability to either continue vital operations or restore those operations in a more timely way. And in the event that a major disaster occurs, to build back better because the plan is already in place. So there's a real need for new tools and guidance to measure resilience and to plan and implement measures to enhance resilience. These are the definitions that the federal government has. We're not satisfied with one, we had to have two. Presidential Policy Directive 8 actually laid this out and established what's known as the National Preparedness System. Presidential Policy Directive 21 brought critical infrastructure under that umbrella and expanded the definition. And I think it's important here to just really note that resilience is about preparing for and adapting to changing conditions and to be able to withstand and rapidly recover from those disruptions. And resilience really addresses all of the activities, starting with prevention through mitigation, response, and recovery. So as Greg noted, we have a fairly large program, at least in NIST, in this environment. We have a total of about $8 million devoted to really 3 areas, and that's on an annual basis. The first area, and this is where I'll spend most of my time this morning, is on what I call the stakeholder engagement component of our work. And that involves the development of the Community Resilience Planning Guide, which I'll talk about in fairly great detail. It also includes what we're calling the Community Resilience Panel, and this is really an independent group of people who have a stake in resilience, everything from state and local government to the engineering community, the insurance industry, but to really identify and address gaps in our understanding for resilience. And then finally, Community Resilience Implementation Guideline that we're working on, which is really a how-to guide to implement resilience at the local scale. The stakeholder engagement portion, I should point out, is called out in the Climate Action Plan that the President released in 2013. Climate action has really driven a lot of the resilience discussions. So in a sense, that's good for our community because it's really brought resilience to the forefront. The second component of our work is a research component. And what we really want to do with the research component is deliver 2 critical tools. One is an ability to measure resilience at the community scale so you can get a baseline understanding of where you are and measure progress as steps are taken to improve resilience. Going along with that is an economics-based decision support tool. So this is a way of actually weighing options as you develop plans for measures, looking at the options and what the payoff is. And we're looking not only here at losses avoided, but also in terms of if there is no event that occurs, was the investment good? In other words, is there a benefit to making those investments? And then finally, Greg mentioned the Center of Excellence. This is a 10-member institution team that's led by Colorado State University. It is a $4 million a year, 5-year effort. And the center is really working on 3 major activities. The first is developing a methodology or a tool to really establish the science basis for measuring resilience. So they're working with a platform based on the Mavis Virgo platform. Right now what they're doing is developing a test bed to look at the linkages among buildings and the infrastructure systems so we can begin to look at cascading effects. They will be bringing in the social and economic aspects a little bit later. And during the coming year, they'll be exercising that test bed with both an earthquake and a tornado scenario. The other thing that they're doing is developing database architectures and management schemes. And this is really to collect data across the full spectrum of resilience. So everything from pre-event through post-event response and long-term recovery. And then the last aspect of their work involves pilot studies to go out and collect data to validate both the test bed and also the database architectures. In late October, we released the first version of what we're calling the Community Resilience Planning Guide for Buildings and Infrastructure Systems. This is really a 2-volume document. Volume 1 really walks through a 6-step process for how to go about developing a resilience plan. It includes a planning example it's a simplified version of a real community, but we wanted to show how the plan could be implemented and work through a couple of examples and develop some proposed actions. In Volume 2, this is really the reference, and we cover in detail how to characterize the social community. We address dependencies and cascading effects, and then we go through individual infrastructure systems and buildings, and in the final chapter talk about metrics. The process, I hope you can read this. I'll go through it in more detail as we go, but this is the 6-step process laid out in a visual form. But it starts with forming a collaborative planning team, characterizing the situation. So this is going to look very familiar to what was done with the SPUR study. That was one of the models that we looked at. We also looked at the Oregon Resilience Plan. to characterize not only the social environment, but also the built environment, and then you make the linkages between the social functions and the buildings and infrastructure. Then there's a process of determining goals and objectives. And this is done really in the absence of applying the hazards. What does it mean to be resilient? When do those functions need to be restored? And then applying the hazards when those functions are expected to be restored. And then through plan development, preparation, review, approval, and implementation. When we began this effort, we started looking at a number of different models and how they were applied. There was some discussion about, do we apply this at the regional scale? Do we apply it at the local scale? We really felt that two things had to be present to apply this. One was a governance structure, and the second was a defined geographical boundary. So we really settled on the local level as the appropriate place to target the guide. So that includes elected officials, local government, community members. There are a number of private sector stakeholders, businesses, and organizations. I went through my slides very slowly. I just got the 5-minute signal. Step 2 is understanding the situation, so characterizing the social dimensions. This is where you can link to not only what your resilience goals are, but also your long-term community development plans and building resilience into those long-term plans. Characterizing the built environment, looking at buildings individually, but then clustering them by function, looking at infrastructure systems and how they connect. Dependencies, those can be internal to the system, external, in other words, dependencies on other systems. There could be temporal, spatial, and source dependencies as well. And then characterization of where those assets are located and how they're used. And here's some linking to the social context to the built environment. Some social functions rely very heavily on the built environment. There's some that change function if there's a disruption. For example, a school that might serve as a community shelter. We have to identify how those services are supported. When are they needed to meet social needs? Are there other dependencies? What are the consequences of loss? In step 3, we begin looking at the long-term community goals. So improving reliability, enhancing community functions, perhaps it's revitalization, but building resilience into all of these other longer-term goals. And it's important to note that resilience can be achieved over time. We don't have earthquakes on a very frequent basis. We don't have hurricanes that occur that frequently. So we can begin planning and implementing changes over a span of decades. Mentioned establishing the performance goals independent of hazards. We want to define those goals in terms of time needed to restore functionality and use those goals to prioritize repair and reconstruction. Goals may also exist criteria or suggest criteria for new construction and retrofit of existing construction. Once you've done that, you look at the prevalent hazards. We suggest evaluating the hazards at 3 levels: the routine, which I classify as the reminder event, the design level, and then maximum considered level or extreme event. Then we go through and characterize the anticipated performance of the infrastructure. So what's the damage level? How long is needed to recover the function, materials, equipment, and so on? And are there dependencies? Are there other systems that need to be restored? This is an example of the summary matrix. So you can see that we have 90% indicating full functionality. The recovery time that's anticipated is with the blue circles. That's the anticipated performance. And so the idea is to close the gaps. So you see, for example, here you have a very large gap. So in order to be resilient, measures would need to be taken to close that gap. In prioritizing the gaps, again, looking at those long-term community goals, what are the social needs during recovery? When do those functions need to be restored before detrimental effects occur? Mary mentioned out-migration as one detrimental effect or impact that might occur. And so it's important to look at those social needs. Looking at alternative solutions. Maybe there are multiple stages of work that can be done. There might be temporary solutions that can be implemented to restore the function while a permanent solution is in place. There might be land use policies or other administrative actions that can be taken, and there can be construction policies, building code changes, and so on. Then selecting solutions, determining how the alternative solutions can be combined to meet community goals. There might be collaborative projects, for example, regionally. And then developing the implementation strategies. What are the benefits of the impact on public safety and social needs? Are there short and long-term benefits versus the cost? And then based on those analyses, determine a preferred implementation strategy. Step 5 is the plan preparation, review, and approval. It's important to note that this is something that needs to have the buy-in of the community and all the stakeholders. So it's important to socialize this very widely before finalizing and approving the plan. And then implementation, and finally maintenance. And I know I'm just about out of time, so let me just quickly talk about next steps. Mentioned the Community Resilience Panel. The panel met for the first time in November, and they are getting up and running very quickly. We're meeting again in early April. Participation is open to anyone who is interested, so please visit our website to look at and to join it. And part of what the panel is doing is developing a resilience knowledge base, so this will be a way of sharing widely the products of the panel. The other thing that we're doing now is encouraging the use of the guide. We have a number of potential pilots that are early adoptions that are going on in various stages, so we're working on those and developing training tools and collecting data as well with the use of the guide. And with that, I'll close. Thank you very much.
Oh, thanks, Steve. So next I'd like to welcome up Laurie Johnson, who Laurie's here in California consultant. Her background is in urban planning, but she's actually looked at these resilience things for a long time. I think played a big role in the SPUR effort in the San Francisco Resilient City, worked with the Rockefeller Foundation. She also chairs the NIST, the NIHR oversight or advisory committee at NIST. And has worked, as Steve Mahin mentioned this morning, worked on a number of the related peer efforts on resilience, tsunamis, and so forth. So really, welcome up, Laurie.
So since the topic is resilience, I'd like to dedicate my presentation, and with the agreement of the panelists, hopefully the session, to my grandmother who turned 100 yesterday. So go resilience. I didn't have time to insert a picture after I thought about announcing it, but she had a wonderful birthday party yesterday, and I'm looking forward to seeing her in a couple of weeks. So we have a long way to go. So I am going to build off of Mary and Steve's talks and talk about the process of planning, and in particular how we deal with some of the issues of really developing data and going from the point of a risk assessment to developing policy and the challenges of doing that. And I just wanted to share some of my experience. So this is what Steve put up. I condensed his picture some, but I'm pulling out the process. And what I really want to emphasize is that this notion of plan development and adoption is a very intensive process involving stakeholders and engaging with them. And I'll speak a little bit more to that, but also coming up with goals and objectives and doing assessments. One other question I really want to put out there, and that I've been experiencing with, is really how detailed the data needs to be. We have real data challenges. We don't have consistent data between perils. We don't even have consistent data about perils from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So one of the real challenges of implementing a process like this is really what sort of underlying data you're going to use and how important is it. And I could speak all day about this process, but I just want to point out some experience I've had doing this post-disaster where the hazard is real. People have now experienced a tragic loss, in this case in New Orleans. But we came in a year after the hurricane. 2 planning efforts had failed, largely because the constituent base wasn't there. People had to evacuate. There was 90% of the city was evacuated when the planning processes were going on. Not even 50% of residents were coming back. So the plans that were being produced were being perceived as being plans done by a very financially motivated, racially motivated, racially segregated, motivated few. And so we had to make our process very representative. And so what you see up there on the right are citywide congresses, of which we had 3. We did these not just in the city, we did these in 5 of the major cities where people were living: Houston, Baton Rouge, Atlanta. We had to do them by satellite, simulcast. We had to raise so much money. The planning was 1/3 of the total cost of this process. The public engagement and the cost of doing this kind of engagement was quite extensive. And at that level, we talked about risk in terms of broad policies. The Corps of Engineers was going to be repairing the levees, but everyone really wanted to begin to dig into the notion of what personal responsibilities they had for risk, and how could they access money to elevate their own homes and be better prepared for future catastrophic events in their neighborhoods. And so those were the kinds of policy level discussions we had at the citywide level. At the neighborhood level, we really got into the details of actually where might you set back from the most hazardous areas and how could we relocate. In this case, people are relocating key community serving facilities on a map of their neighborhood. So I just want to point this out, that this is the kind of work that has to be done to engage on the topic of risk. And I also want to point out that this is not something that has to be incredibly technical, and it may not even be useful to be so. New Orleans has an illiteracy rate of 30%. We had to figure out how to do this in a way where we couldn't be discussing probabilities and various things with them. We had to make this real, and we had to make it very, very hands-on. So I want to talk about the use of scenarios and their value. And I would like to go back to how the Resilient City Project in San Francisco began. In my opinion, it really began by the work of a lot of people in this room participating in the 2006 100th anniversary conference for the 1906 earthquake. And the scenario that was produced using HAZUS, and then panels of people trying to come up with estimates. Charlie was very involved in coming up with estimates of fire loss, and putting out that number, 150 billion. Which we believed was low, and communicating that the way we did, inviting political leaders, and also I think having the benefit of Hurricane Katrina having happened the year before, and many political leaders having actually traveled to New Orleans and thinking about what this would be like if we had that scale of event in the Bay Area. I think all of those things really came together to give us that window of opportunity to launch the Resilient City. It's through that project that we actually met staff from SPUR, and the words I use are that the earthquake community joined up with SPUR, which is the civic organization in San Francisco. And so we really moved out of our sort of traditional comfort zone of working amongst ourselves. And what happened through that scenario? Well, one was the reinvigoration of the CAPS program. Anybody who was involved with that knows that there was a lack of political support and funding for that at City Hall. And so CAPS got kind of reinvigorated and refunded and launched with ATC in the lead in 2008. At the same time in 2008, the mayor launched a program called the Citywide Disaster Resilience and Recovery Initiative. And we also joined up and launched the SPUR Resilience Initiative in 2007. I'll say one thing that Mary said. She said it was a huge group. It was a hugely diverse group of people, but it actually wasn't a huge group. It was about two dozen people or so, but very diverse. And the reason I say that is also that SPUR was a civic organization. It was not a city organization, and so this was not city policy. And that's been a misconception of that for a while. The city policy is CAPS, and the city policy is the Recovery Initiative. But SPUR has been very influential and has really been relied upon by city staff because we brought them along in the process. So out of the SPUR policy process, I won't go into all the details. You know a lot about these, the Earthquake SAR, 100 Resilient City Soft Story Program, the ESIP program. What I want to talk about is the Lifelines Council. This was a recommendation we made in the SPUR report. The reason being we couldn't make the detailed recommendations we were making for new buildings and existing buildings because we simply didn't have the data. And so what we said to the mayor, and he took us up on this, was you need to launch some sort of body and bring all the operators together, both public and private, who work and operate in San Francisco on a regular basis and get them to start talking so we can really begin to understand what they're doing, what they haven't done yet, what actions they're taking, both in mitigation and preparedness. And so that's what we did in 2009. And I had the honor of serving as staff to the Lifelines Council for a number of years. We also got to a point, though, we had done a lot of sharing. Everyone had we'd taken each sector and asked one of the utility operators to take the lead in talking about the work they were doing. And so now what do? Everybody recognized we needed to do something together. And we really didn't get to the point of launching something until 2011 in what we called an interdependency study. And we really struggled with how were we going to do that methodology. We had months of discussions about, well, nobody wanted, everybody felt it needed to be data intensive. But nobody wanted to give us their data. How were we going to maintain the privacy of that data? And so what we finally, actually, I was inspired by the work that Keith Porter had done on Shakeout in Southern California, and also Stephanie Chang and others had done in Vancouver in preparation for the Olympics, was really what I would call much more qualitative interdependency analyses. And this really hadn't been done much besides those two efforts. And so what we did was actually take the 06 anniversary scenario, the magnitude 7.9 on a San Andreas earthquake, and what we agreed was that we would structure panels of operators to actually talk about first what the impacts to their systems would be in a qualitative way, and then to describe what they were doing about that. Then we did these in an ordered way. We started with the most fixed and most necessary physical systems like roads, the electricity, the water, the gas, and then we worked our way to what I would call more less fixed systems like telecom and also point systems like the port and the airport. And so as we did this, we would then, once everyone told us what their estimates of restoration were and what their likely dependencies were, we would then tell them what all of the operators before them had said during their panels. And so what we were able to do was actually construct a scenario over time in which people not only began to invest in what they were saying, but began to recognize how what they were saying and the misconceptions that they had of the restorations of other operators and how that affected their own restorations. So it was very visceral in terms of their beginning to recognize that they were actually misunderstanding what others were going to be providing and that they had those gaps in their own plans. And so the interdependencies began to fall out through that process. And through this, we actually got what I would call a much more enhanced scenario that included lifeline performance. We now have a component of the scenario that tells us what performance of lifeline systems would be like in a 7.9 earthquake. And we also developed an action agenda that the Lifelines Council is working on. So these are just some slides from that process. The first is really, when we looked at it in the end, these are just simple shadings of green, yellow, red, severe damage, moderate damage, limit damage, of how these systems summed up in San Francisco only. So regional roads would do well, but city streets would be clogged with debris and it would take many months to clear them. Electric power, others, most everybody was kind of in that moderate range. The port also, because of the damage to the seawall along San Francisco and liquefaction risks, would also be seeing severe damage. Then we looked at restoration and similarly began to see real challenges driven largely by cascading effects and interdependencies and dependencies, where others like natural gas taking a long time to restore once they had turned those systems off. Transit really depending on clearing the streets, clearing and getting electricity and other fuels restored, the airport and fuel also being real dependencies. And this is just the restoration curves that we developed for that process. And so what you can see here is the restoration for natural gas is in red, it has a really long tail. Also clearing local roads is in brown, the dashed one has a long tail. Telecom was kind of a slow, steady progression because they depend on roads. And you see some other really interesting depending, oh, I'm sorry, that's not telecom, that was actually transit, depending on roads. And then up here, you see some interesting connections where two systems are actually following each other. So in the case of electricity, which is in green, you actually have telecom kind of operating well, then the batteries die out, and it only restores at the same rate that telecom is restoring. And this is actually in the NIST guide. And so then we actually looked through all those different kinds of interdependencies, whether they were co-location dependencies, cascading effects, all that kind of stuff. And we tried to actually show who depended on who and what kind of dependency it was. So this is just one of those illustrations of cascading effects where you can see the cascading effects and interactions between one type of system and another. And this, which Greg said, I really want to know how you're going to explain this one, Laurie. What this one really is doing is kind of like let your eyes actually go out of focus for a second. And what you'll see is that there's heavy dependence on telecom. Everybody really depends on telecom. All these arrows going into telecom, all these arrows going to regional roads. Everyone's going to need access to regional and local roads, and then you see some areas like natural gas where they don't really have a lot of dependencies, but they alone are going to have those big disruptions. And so that was just one more way to sum it up as a takeaway for everybody. And here's the work program, which I don't have a chance to go into, but essentially there are 3 parts. One was that through this process we identified choke points, places where everybody had either mutually co-located facilities or areas that were really vulnerable that everybody passed through, like the seawall and the liquefaction area around Mission Creek, where everybody seems to have their corporate yards and all of their equipment stored. We also identified a number of jointly shared mitigation efforts, and we also identified a number of efforts around planning and preparedness. And the Lifelines Council is working on this work program now. So we're taking that same approach with a peer project that we're going to be starting this next month, which is really looking at a qualitative assessment of earthquake early warning, where we're going to be doing a series of structured panel interviews with various sectors, and there's 14 that this date is identified, in which we're actually going to try to structure those of trying to get to major systems first, like BART and others, who might actually take an earthquake early warning and make a decision, and it's really going to be that not only the warning itself, but the cascading effects of other users' decisions that are going to affect us individually. So we're going to try to work through that same kind of process as we did with the Lifeline study. And I just want to point out that scenarios don't have to be hypothetical, they can be real. We're doing a project for the Seismic Safety Commission right now, which is looking at lessons learned from the Napa earthquake, in which we're going to be coming up with a number of recommendations around geosciences, infrastructure, structures, people, businesses, government, and institutions, really derived a lot from your work in analyzing the event and making some recommended actions with emphasis on what the state could do on resilience going forward. And I just want to point one more out, which is the project that will be coming online over the next year, which is a haywire scenario, a magnitude 7 event on the Hayward Fault. So I think this will be the next scenario, like the 7.9 scenario we did for the Bay Area. This will be the next really comprehensive scenario. This is part of the USGS SAFER projects, like Shakeout down in LA, and its impacts on, for those who are from LA and know what the tail effect has been with Mayor Garcetti really picking up the ball and working on the Resilient by Design project with the city and implementing recommendations and issues that arose from Shakeout. So I'm hopeful that we'll have some new data and that we can work with a number of East-based cities, and I won't go into the details of what we're doing on that right now. So Mary said I had a third type of resilience to talk about, when really what I wanted to say was that there's engineering resilience, there's what we call ecological resilience, which involves some sort of adaptation to an event, not just a bouncing back to the status quo, but there's also something called transformative resilience. And this really comes much more from the sociological point of view, that really disasters can be a moment of transformation. And we see this in terms of policy making a lot, and people making changes in their lives once they experience disasters. But I think it really comes back to the points that Mary was making about how we think about the built environment as well, and whether or not an engineering resilience approach really gets us far enough into resilience overall after a really damaging event. If we only perform to a life safety standard, we're only getting us to a certain point of resilience and recovery. And we need those adaptive strategies to carry us through that short-term period, and that's really what they're for. They help us get through the response period and that early restoration. And then we have to have these transformative resilience strategies, which right now in the built environment means really huge things like major buyouts or cordoning off downtown Christchurch for 2 years while we tear down and rebuild all the buildings. But if we begin to think about transformative resilience in the built environment sooner, before an event, and how we can actually build on what David Lallemont said in terms of adaptation of structures to make them more resilient over time, I think we're actually going to have a much more robust built environment that can actually carry us much further into recovery than we currently do. And my last slide is just to say that I hope you remember that resilience is actually a holistic process, and the part that we focus on is looking at this pyramid from the bottom up. We think about the land and its vulnerability, we think about structures, we think about infrastructure, but there's a whole group of people out there, the people that we'll have to work with on doing resilience plan, that really see this pyramid from the top down. They think about themselves, their livelihoods, government and community institutions, and the economy first before they're actually thinking about buildings. And it's really the convergence of both of those that come together for resilience planning. So we need to make new friends if we're going to do this work right. Thank you.
One more talk. Having kind of co-planned and moderated this with Steve Mahin, I should have had the good sense to not put myself at the end of 3 excellent speakers like that. Before I get started, I'll remind everybody, when I finish up, we're going to have kind of time for questions and discussion, so be thinking about questions you have for the other folks so we can get right into that. So what I'm going to try to do is talk a little bit about what the research challenges are. And I think kind of in a nutshell, a big research challenge is to try to apply our kind of science and engineering tools to kind of quantify a lot of these metrics we saw. And Laurie had some great slides of recoveries and things like that, that I think how we can better quantify that, that's an important role we can play. So I think in looking at how performance-based engineering, and I'll really kind of focus on that as having been Pier's mission for many years, how this kind of adapts and supports and morphs into looking broadly at resilience. You know, we look at assessing the 3Ds, the death, dollars, and downtimes, the casualty rates, the loss of function, and the financial loss. We've looked at kind of individual facilities, looking at geographically distributed systems, and then looking more broadly at collections of those systems in communities. And I think going beyond kind of the 3Ds, looking at the implications of performance of facilities and systems on recovery, something that came out of, drew my attention from the San Francisco Resilient City Initiative was it's safe to occupy, shelter in place for large amounts of residences. There could be damage, but what's the threshold of damage that displaces people, interdependencies? And then finally, I think we can do a lot of assessment, but we really then have to say, how do we turn that around and really develop solutions that has improved resilience? Identifying critical vulnerabilities, non-ductile concrete buildings is a good example. But not just identify them, then figure out, okay, how do we quickly screen them? How do we do assessments, and what are effective retrofit tools? And there's other examples there. And then tools for effective and economical evaluation and retrofit. The FEMA P807, the soft story retrofit that really came about through that Resilient City Initiative in San Francisco is a need. Cost-benefit analyses that could help kind of guide and support the development of public policies. And then what's, for a lot of us, geotech, earthquake, structural engineers, looking at innovative systems, building systems, bridge systems, and so forth. How can these be supported and improve resilience? The so-called performance-based framework has kind of been a hallmark of peer, and in some sense, like a lot of good ideas, it's sort of common sense to break the problem down of assessing a facility, going from the earth sciences through the structural engineering, geotechnical engineering, loss analysis, and so forth. And I think one of the things that really helped in organizing the peer work was that this deliberate framework had these touch points between different disciplines about how we hand off data to each other. Because one person, one discipline can't do it all. We have to kind of work collectively. And then, of course, part of that, I dug out one of the old triple integral slides, is recognizing uncertainty and wanting to propagate the uncertainties from ground motions through to the final these decision metrics. And recognizing, too, that these decision metrics, when you do this in this rigorous sense, they're always scalars. We have a mean annual frequency of collapse, and Jack Baker reminds me, you can't get a mean annual frequency of a vector. You always have to get it of a scalar. So then resilience is going to be a collection of these scalars. But for example, we could look at buildings and get these loss curves and the contributions to loss from repair, the risk of demolition for the building, which is Christchurch really demonstrated, and research has borne out. That's a major component, in collapse, and get expected values. And we could also think about, though, this is a pretty kind of comprehensive, elaborate assessment to get an expected value. But then when we go and design things, we try to pick one level, say a design basis earthquake or maximum considered earthquake, or if it's a city, one scenario, and to think yourself, okay, to get your arms around decision making, you can't look at kind of the full kind of comprehensive level of risk. But the idea is, can we benchmark or calibrate these design level events, or these scenario level things, such that we design for that overall they give us the right behavior, or the target we want. So the question is, how do assessment of individual facilities feed into, this is a slide we've seen from Mary and the other speakers today. I think that there's good educated guesses on what the housing stock in San Francisco will do and so forth, but a big thing about performance-based techniques we have is to better quantify those metrics for a whole host of different facilities, building types, bridge types, other types of infrastructure in the area, and then the systems. Now, if you think about what the research challenge is, I think there's always more to do on, say, characterizing collapse or to characterizing loss, but that's pretty well developed. But what's probably not as well developed is kind of how we kind of quantify this recovery process, the time to restoration that it's going to take, which of course is at the heart, one of the hearts of resilience. So I wanted just to show an example. This is some of the work that Henry Burton did during his dissertation, which was basically taking the framework we have for looking at, say, the risk of damage and the risk of collapse, and just expanding that out a little bit more to say, well, if the building's non-collapsed, can it be inhabited? What's the inherent safety of the building? And if it needs to be repaired, can it be inhabited or not during repair? So when you break it down into these different constituent parts, there's different factors that you'll need to quantify. And so, for example, if we look at the building vacated until repaired, to think about, okay, how quickly can people get back into the building? There's this sort of mobilization time. Then there's the repair time itself, and maybe it doesn't need to be full repairs to get people, say, back into a building. And this is just kind of one of the links on this kind of tree. You could look down each one and also recognize that given the uncertainty in the ground motion and the uncertainty in the building population, that one scenario could bring out one realization for one building, but to then look at this probabilistically. So again, to kind of feed those ideas. Oh, those integrals got big and messy. It's funny, I have Mac too at home, but you get the idea is that we kind of can kind of track these ideas through, but then to quantify them and to propagate the uncertainties in the ground motions, performance of the building, the repair times, and so forth, to get kind of an expected value for, given, say, a condition on an intensity measure of ground shaking, what's the expected time for restoration for a building? You could then take that and broaden that out to a community, where you would start by thinking about scenarios and what's the intensity for a bunch of buildings, thinking also about what's the correlation of things between the building stock when things were built and so forth, and to look, and again, to try to boil this down to a bunch of scalar quantities. It might be like, what's the disruption to residential housing? How many people days of disruption are there to residential housing? that could be characterized in a rigorous probabilistic sense, but then that can help inform then decisions and looking broader at all the other issues that face a community. And then once you have these tools, you can then start to do very careful analyses to say, well, what if, the soft story ordinance in San Francisco, what if we retrofit these first stories of these soft story buildings? How much of a change will that make? And then you could really help inform, again, strategies that communities can take. When we look at distributed systems, it's kind of like the same story. This is years ago, Ann Karamijian did some work on transportation systems. The EMS here at the same time are looking at those. And people continue to look at it because it's a hard problem, transportation or other systems. Because you can take this same framework, but you're looking at multiple intensity measures at multiple sites for multiple facilities, bridges and roads across the network. And then when you get all that damage quantified, then you have to look at what's the system analysis. If it's looking at a transportation network, you might be thinking of delay times. And of course, Jim Moore, who had worked on this for a period of years ago, points out that looking at delay times after an earthquake in a period of stress is different than looking at in steady state, because the origin destination, where people want to travel after an earthquake has changed. So it's a tough problem, especially as you look at that restoration. But there's a lot of tough scientific problems. This is a slide Jack Baker and students looking at, just to look at the variability in ground motion, not just at one site, but across a region. So you could get a mean value for a magnitude and distance, and if you knew the VS30, the soil properties over the region accurately, a mean value. But there's going to be variation both within an earthquake across a region, and then between different earthquakes. And I think we're still trying to get enough data to kind of characterize that aspect, what's that variability across the region. And of course, you can then feed that in, and part of their work shows that depending how you characterize this variability, it could have a big impact on the resulting calculation, say, of delay times. I want to mention a little bit that, I think as we start to go from one site to looking over regions, we just don't have as much data. And I think over the past 15 or 20 years, while in engineering we made headway, the earth scientists have on ground motion simulations. This just gives a snapshot of some cybershake effort that SCEC's doing down in LA, just showing the resolution on the right that you could get with these advanced simulation-based ground motion simulating the earthquakes, versus on the left, the ground motion prediction equations. So I think increasingly to work closer with the earth scientists who are using these simulations. Because just to point out, I find a lot of us now are running incremental dynamic analyses, thousands or tens of thousands of analyses on the computers we have, but we're still working with recorded ground motions that really don't get to very extreme events. This plot on the right, those are conditional mean spectra. If you can see the yellow one, that's a 2% and 50 for the city of site in San Jose. And then plotted on top of that are all the ground motions from the NGA database. And you can see that even at that 2% and 50 level, we really don't have many ground motions. That's why we're faced with scaling them. If you look at things like duration, the same is true there. A lot of these ground motions are from smaller events, and the plot on the lower right just shows those little box plots show the durations of all the ground motions in databases versus that distribution shown on the far right. If you're doing a scenario up in Cascadia zone, up in Seattle, the kind of ground motions that would be predicted up there, we just don't have the motions. So again, I think coupling advanced simulations, working closely, building into these scenarios, looking at regions. So just a few more kind of thoughts on that is that if you, Laurie mentioned like the HAZIS study, the scenario study of the 1906 earthquake, or a repeat in 2006 was big, as are these other scenario studies to demonstrate how, what the vulnerabilities of communities are. But they're still being done with HAZIS, which you could say is great. It's still 20-year-old technology based on these empirical models. And again, so you can think about it as a future. This is a slide I borrowed from Professor Hori in the University of Tokyo. More of a simulation-based one, bringing all the modern tools and information we have together in a system that could do this quickly, look at more what-if scenarios, look at the variability in different scenarios in a fast enough time that it could affect decision-making. This is another slide we're preparing for today. I dug into some old peer slides. This one Bill Holmes put together around the year 2000, talking about the performance-based engine we were developing as a way that was going to kind of merge on the left, like building-specific ASC 41 or then FEMA 273 type analyses, with the HAZUS on the far right, the regional analyses, which is very empirical, and then some probable loss kind of analyses in the middle, kind of how this performance engine can really transcend across that spectrum. Now thinking about what we've accomplished, I think on the building specific, we have FEMA P58, which really embodied a lot of the peer methodology for loss assessment on building specific. That's advanced quite a bit. But frankly, and maybe others can chime in later in questions, if you look at kind of the HAZUS end of things, have we really, there's the potential to move into that and to make big advancements there, but have we done that yet? I think that's the challenge. A couple more slides I need to rush through is that, how do we present the data when we do loss analyses? This is a slide of some benefit cost analyses we did looking at different retrofit strategies. And in this case, we looked at the benefits being the reduce in life loss and also the economic reduced in repair costs. We didn't look at downtime. But we could, if we take the life loss and turn it into dollars, which kind of looking at broad policies one might want to do, you could say, well, what's the benefit that's going to be done by certain retrofit strategies? First to say, can you afford it or can society afford it? But if you break down that benefit into, well, how much is life safety versus how much is direct economic benefit to that building owner, it can help inform decisions and policies about who pays for that retrofit. The idea of life safety, you say, well, maybe that's a society benefit, so that should be tax discounts or so forth, versus the direct benefit that the owner gets. Finally, the last slide before I wrap up is, looking at our new buildings. There's been some studies looking at, for example, and also the whole notion of this kind of building rating system as a way to incentivize higher performance buildings. But, the buildings we have now, we believe they're safe, and studies show they are, but there could be very long downtimes, disrupting repairs to the buildings. But to say, okay, how can we reduce this through better structural enhancements? There's been studies to say, in this case, going from might be 18-month repair down to 8 months if you employ some really seismic isolation on a tall building, which we're still figuring out how you would actually do that. Or non-structural enhancements, more, I'll call them seismic interiors, more robust partition walls and things like that. And it's only really when you do both of these things, structural enhancements only get you so far, it has to be non-structural ones, but then you could bring together to really reduce those downtimes dramatically. Some of this, though, especially on the non-structural, is really wishful thinking. Like if we had a partition that could undergo 1% drift without being damaged, then we could repair, or then we could reoccupy the building. So those are some of the research challenges. So just kind of final remarks is I think, there's research to kind of extend the performance-based framework, really looking at the disruption and recovery, going in that direction, looking at time-dependent hazards and how that feeds into the risk, geographically distributed systems. Innovations by which we can reduce damage and disruption to buildings and also communicate things to facilitate rebuilding. And then think about how all these metrics we calculate, how they can facilitate decision-making. And I think I have in here, one thing I'm still trying to in my own mind is reconciling this full probabilistic approach to how that feeds into these kind of scenario models and can inform, kind of make the scenarios better because they've proven to be the scenarios kind of effective decision-making things with large communities, but they can be informed by the full probabilistic. In new technologies, it took me a while until I understood that disruptive technologies were good things, kind of like the negative, when you get a negative report back from your doctor, that's a good thing. But when you think about these large systems and all the data you need and everything, I think we really need to kind of embrace these new technologies and then figure out who the stakeholders are. When we're doing the first performance-based engineering, the structural and geotechnical engineers were our clients. We developed tools they used. In this new world of resilience, who are the clients out there between the researchers and the community? Who are the industry professionals who are going to use these tools and what are their needs? Okay, so I'll wrap my talk up there, just a minute or two over. Thank you. I'd like to welcome back the four speakers from this, well, three other speakers, myself from this morning, and then kind of invite questions and discussion from the audience. So why don't you guys all, we'll huddle around. John, if you want to go. Yeah, there is a microphone, so that would help.
Is this on?
Yeah.
All right, so I'm an engineer, and I was very interested in the handoff between our performance-based earthquake engineering products and the resiliency goals that you've articulated. And I guess my question concerns that handoff, and so I suppose it's directed mostly to Mary and Greg, because we talked about that in some detail. And it seems that the handoff occurs at the level of either loss curves or perhaps some fragility curves. And it seems that, and also the hazard that feeds into the x-axis. It seems that a lot of the curves we produce are driven by engineering simulations. So we simulate how a system's going to perform, and we essentially accept that the result of that simulation is correct. And then we move on from that and start making decisions and convert it into resilience. So I wonder if, I'd like to get your reaction to this. As we move forward and we try to think of research directions, so much hinges on those simulations that we should be thinking pretty hard about validation of the simulations we're running. And we have opportunities to do that, it would seem to me. So for example, Napa earthquake, if we apply our methodologies to what the building stock was there, do we get anywhere close to the losses that were actually observed? Or are we out by a factor of 10? We have New Zealand, of course. We have a major earthquake in Japan in 2011. So it would seem to me that there's a lot of research opportunity in making sure that our simulations actually work. Another thing that ties into that is when you run those simulations, you do it with an engineering model. And some other researcher might have used a different engineering model. And then there's all those models that haven't even been developed yet, and we can't know possibly what they would say. So how do we deal with the fact that if we're relying on the models, there's many possible outcomes, and that's epistemic uncertainty, and how do we deal with that? Is that important or not as we go into the resilience space? And I guess the third point related to all this is correlation. And I think you mentioned this, Greg. Sorry to be so long. But I think these points are all connected together. So correlation is, for example, if a particular building does better than what your model would have said, would the building 2 blocks over also do better? Or might do worse or whatever. So that's the correlation issue. So it seems to me with all of these considerations, those are research opportunities that we might want to be thinking about if it makes a difference in the resilience space. But do these things actually matter? And I suspect they probably do. So I'd just like to get your reaction to that.
Well, I hope they do matter. But, and actually, John, you had addressed that a little bit to Mary and me, but I'd actually like to ask Laurie to chime in a little bit because, I mentioned that, our rigorous probabilistic analysis with all the variability and stuff like that, and it's subject to validation and all that, but at least we're exploring that space. Sometimes the scenario models are kind of a mean value, and you kind of hope they're the mean of the right thing. You hope they're the right scenario. But I guess I'd like to, maybe ask Laurie, because I think the answer is as researchers, we'll always want to try to validate things. It's hard. Ann Comerio on the transportation study she did for Pier 10 years ago, we said, well, take your model and compare it to Loma Prieta. How well did it do? And it's tough to do that, because you got to kind of break down, all the uncertainty. If the model didn't do well, is it in the transportation model or is it in the ground shaking and so forth? I think we should try to do that, but it's really tough. But I'd like to ask kind of Laurie this question about the precision or accuracy and how that, what's your view of it? Talking to communities and all, knowing do you believe the scenarios? Or, in other words, those results, or how much the exact answer hinges on the precision of those measures.
Well, I'm going to speak two ways. One is, I'm not sure how precise it needs to be to really begin the process of planning. But I think to get appropriate strategies and to make sure we're really doing the work of risk reduction, we need precision. Because we can make up great strategies, we can build a lot of support, but are we really doing the right work? And we really don't know. I love the slide you showed at the end, Greg, of what really, who should pay, is really the kinds of questions people are going to ask as we try to do this kind of work. And I think to break down something like a retrofit strategy into the components of protecting life safety versus moving beyond that and who should bear that cost, I think is the kind of precision that we're going to need to begin to move towards as engineers. But I would also just, as you were asking that question, John, I just kept thinking about my 10-year life at RMS, working with CAT models, because the insurance industry asks all those questions of us, and the main reason they do is because of the correlation issues. Because of the spatial correlation of insuring too many of the same kinds of structures, because they appeal to a market, so they insure all of the Walgreens or whatever, and they're all built the same. And they all perform the same, ironically, or they don't sometimes, and then they want to know why. And then, the other issue is the sensitivity and the uncertainty. And so I think, I'm surprised there isn't more. I mean, we had to do incredible amounts of validation. With every kind of event, we were constantly asked for that, and I spent most of my career running on the road after events happened, explaining the model's performance and how we were going to fix it. And so I think that we should do more work, because I think you learn through that process. I think the models have gotten so much better through the validation processes and the questions that people have asked, and I think it's really getting at. It really helps you have one word that you didn't say in there is sensitivity. I think through that kind of work, you really learn the value of the sensitivity of various parameters and what adjustments to various things can make, and how that sort of affects when you look at the built environment in an accumulated way, like a portfolio of data or like a community.
I would just add one comment, which is, I agree with what Laurie said, and I think all the things John is asking for is important. It's more work for us, basically, as researchers. And yes, we need to do it. But we don't need to have the perfect be the enemy of the good, right? We need to not keep waiting to find the exact right. If we did that, we wouldn't even have building codes. I mean, we work with what we have, and we improve what we have. So I think that's kind of part of the engineering model, and it's the way engineering thinks and behaves. So I don't see that as a problem for us. I see that as our natural environment.
Do you have anything to add?
I'm not sure how much to add to that.
Okay. One last comment I'll make, and then we'll see if there's others. Those folks that have been involved with the Concrete Coalition, and of course now there's some traction on looking at these non-ductile concrete buildings. One of the messages was to, a lot of debate about how vulnerable, how hazardous these buildings are, but if we could speak collectively with a common voice, in spite of all the variability and uncertainties in our model, folks accept hazard maps not really knowing that it's 5 ground motion prediction equations that are be quite different, that are just averaged together. Yeah.
Hi there. So I'm a public policy person. I'm interested in policy refinement, spread, and implementation. So the NIST initiative, incredibly exciting to see resilience being talking about it that way at a national scale. But we have 3,000 counties, 20,000 cities, 350 metropolitan areas. Pilots are not going to do it. So how do we enhance the scaling up of building of linkages between this kind of work and
tell you from my experience with some of the communities and states that I've been talking to, some of that work is actually going on at the state level, where the state is developing their own plans. They're actually overlaying the NIST guide and using that as a way to inform and maybe improve on their plans that they're already implementing. But the actual kind of on-the-ground work takes place at the local level. So I think there's an opportunity here for the federal government to provide tools like the NIST guide, like tools that other agencies are providing, and for the states and the local communities to really have the opportunity to begin these conversations and work together on those implementations. I agree that doing an implementation here and another one there is not really going to get us where we need to be, but it does provide an opportunity to show how these tools can be implemented and used, and it provides some sort of, if you will, almost advertising that allows their proliferation.
I think there's another thing, and this requires us stepping outside of our comfort zone, our engineering comfort zone. And that is that maybe at some point, as we look at these analyses, as we look at this research about resilience, we might want to stand up and say, life safety isn't good enough. We need to really change the codes. And that is a huge step for the engineering community to take that. And I think it's going to take some research. I don't think we're there yet, but I think we might get there. And I think we have to seriously think about the implications of that in the larger community and the significance. That's a scale up. That's a big scale up if that happens. So those are the kinds of things I think we have some power to influence and is important for us to pay attention to.
So I have a couple of points. One is, I call it carrots and sticks. I think the federal government plays a great role in both, providing carrots with incentives for pilots, and also providing sticks. Like one of the sticks is just the requirement that FEMA has that all jurisdictions need to have a local hazard mitigation plan. But we have to go further. I think one of the things we have to realize is that the kind of information we produce doesn't just feed into the traditional pathways that we think of, like codes or land use requirements for geologic data. But there are many policy pathways, and one of the things we're going to need to do is better link up carrots and sticks. And for example, in California, we have a law that requires that the safety element of the general plan is consistent with the hazard mitigation plan. Most states don't have that, and that's actually really powerful. And if you think about, if you then take that one step further and you link that up to the capital plan, which is how a jurisdiction plans to spend its money on all of its investments, upgrading its public facilities, its infrastructure, et cetera, you link those three things together, and now you have a much more powerful policy toolkit. And so I think we need to get smarter at understanding how our constituents, if they are local governments, really operate, and how we can actually link together carrots and sticks in a more integrated way.
Thanks, Ray. So, Laurie and I are speaking the same language, and I think it's interesting to hear at the peer meeting we're talking already about public policy. And we'll see that, I think, more tomorrow, but I think possibly a partial answer to John's question and the basis for my question is in the pyramid that Laurie showed. The engineers, the researchers are working at the bottom of that pyramid, but the decision makers are working at the top. We need to be in some kind of sync about that, but that doesn't mean that one of them is wrong. It means that they're all part of that same system, and that's the way the research does. It has to be that detailed. It has to be that, you might say, overly detailed to some people's view, but that's the way research gets done. You never know what you're going to find. You have to do it that way. Now, to my question, a lot has been said this morning, and by the way, Mary, I think San Francisco is going to get there soon on bettering safety for their code, but a lot has been said about San Francisco's work and the long process it took, and the stakeholder outreach, and the delays, and the infrastructure council, and everything that went into that. And right now, Los Angeles is kind of doing it a different way. Almost by fiat is coming in and saying we're going to have these two major programs without having done the outreach, the handholding, even the engineering, or the inventory, or the planning, or the infrastructure. Now, I guess my question is, are they breaking the mold and showing us something new? Or are they making things difficult for those who are trying to take lessons from San Francisco. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? I personally am nervous, but my goodness, if they can show that it can just be done by fiat, I don't think that's reproducible somewhere else. But wow, what a time saver.
Okay, you struck a nerve with that one. Go ahead.
Back to carrots and sticks. I think we have been very blessed in San Francisco with the continuity in government between Mayor Newsom and Mayor Lee, and the support that that has provided us to work a process that I think we started quite hesitantly, and that's why there was so much empowerment and capacity building as part of that, because we weren't sure we had the support. And so that support has grown. Los Angeles has a strong mayor who's really bought into this, and he is owning it, and I think that's the stick. You know, we were taking a carrot approach, you know, collaboration. He's taking a stick approach. He's very behind it. But, word of caution, because I see this all the time working in communities. Next mayor, if it's a big transition, all of that stuff is at risk. And
Or mayors anywhere else.
yeah, anywhere else, and that is a real problem. I could have given a whole lecture, and would love to give the next lecture of my talk would be about implementation, how incredibly challenging it is to do, because these are long-term plans and processes. And so you've got to have the money and the political will to sustain these efforts over time. And we don't have that many examples. We don't fund that kind of long-term research to generally either post-disaster recovery or pre-disaster resilience. To find out that pathway and all those challenges that the policymakers, you know, and the financial aspects and the, you know, the stakeholder convincing that has to go on to really affect change. So there's a lot more work we need to do there. We don't understand it.
Steve, has LA shortcutted the great work that NIST is doing? Is that a good thing, or are they setting a bad example?
Can you repeat the first part of the question?
Are they shortcutting the careful thought that NIST has put into that resilience framework that came from Spur and Oregon?
In the Los Angeles example?
Yeah.
I think it's a different way of doing it. I think, you know, to kind of build on Laurie's point, if you don't have the larger buy-in, if it's just simply something that the administration is pushing very heavily, and there's an administration change, you may lose that momentum in the administration change. So having that community buy-in is a way of keeping momentum moving forward, especially if it's your large employers and residents that are really, you know, supporting and advocating for making changes to improve resilience.
Also, I just add, Lucy's made hundreds of meetings. So don't think, while there hasn't been the same sort of consensus body meeting working on this, she has been on the street for a year working that process, meeting with the major employers, with the major building owners, you know, all the various constituent groups. So that has been what she did in that process. So
Again,
it's a year-long effort, and so
again,
it's a different style,
yeah.
but it's still stakeholder engagement. She had the engineering group come together to help with the rating thing, and so I think it's, you know, it's a different process. I know you would disagree, but
Again, it's a question I
it's
hope to
still
discuss
stakeholder
in
engagement.
the next 2 days. I hope to discuss again, because it goes directly to your point, your last slide, Greg, and to the pyramid idea of how do we bring this together, and I hope we'll hear more about it in the next couple of days.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, let's see over here.
James Beal, arguing with quick awareness. Thank you, Laurie, for pointing out about the sticks and carrots. I grew up in California, and I always thought it was comprised of fruits and nuts. There's a great quote I was reminded when John Stewart was speaking that is, do not wish to be anything but what you are and try to be that perfectly. And that ties us into the problem with models. I was around when HAZUS was introduced, and HAZUS was a tool so that a community could do a rapid assessment to see whether they might qualify for a disaster declaration. And it's being used far more broadly than it was ever created to be. The great quote, all models are wrong, some are useful. The practical question always is, how wrong do they have to be of no use? And I'm troubled, now people are kind of warming up to scenarios, but in the late 70s, Lawrence von Thun with Bureau of Rec was exploring conversations on how to define the maximum credible earthquake. which as a regulatory agency, this was called MCE. And the MCE for the Hayward fault is 7.5, and for the San Andreas fault it would be an 8, but when people go to the scenarios, they, the Bay Bridge, they put it down to a 7.2 or 7.25. The scenarios you showed, they're not the MCE, and is there some impediment for doing that?
I just have a couple of comments just on the last point there. I think the MCE is in the building code to kind of be that protection against life safety or some collapse safety. And I think the spur, and Laurie, you can maybe back me up or comment further, the idea is if the city's looking at resilience, that they were looking at a more frequent earthquake, lower intensity, more frequent, that seemed to be kind of a more manageable level to deal with things, especially when they're dealing with questions of disruption, assuming that, say, life safety things are covered by buildings and bridges and so forth were built per the MCE, so they have that higher safety level. Another comment I would just make on models, and I certainly agree with you that the models we have are not unreliable, but certainly imprecise and constantly being improved. I mean, when we found out about conditional means factor, we realized we were scaling ground motions the wrong way to look at collapse. But I just think that we need some models to help make decisions, and as long as we have kind of faith that we feel they're reasonable and they'll change in time, I think that we have to rely on those models. And I think that the example you gave of HAZUS, I think, is a great one, that it was a tool developed for one purpose. It's kind of been stretched and morphed into another, but I think that's now the incentive for us to really go back to, reinvent that sort of model with better knowledge, technologies, and so forth.
Right. So that's one of the things that I didn't have a whole lot of time to point out, but in the NIST guide, we actually suggest that communities look at 3 levels of event. The routine event is a reminder event. Think of a small earthquake, you feel the shaking. It's a reminder that the threat exists, but there's no real damage or interruption that occurs. The design event is the event that you expect to occur within the lifetime of buildings and infrastructure systems. And that's the event that you use for your resilience planning. So you want to make sure that the disruption that happens as a result of that event is something that's manageable by the community. It doesn't lead to detrimental impacts to the community. Then the extreme event, the earthquake scenario, would be the maximum considered earthquake. And in that case, you recognize that there will be widespread damage. And the idea is that if you plan and implement it for resilience, you'll reduce the time that is required for recovery, and hopefully the cost as well.
And I'll just say, I really hope that the next generation has this as a fully probabilistic kind of tool, because I think you really need both. And certainly the way the insurance industry uses it is as, they appreciate what a 1% annualized probability is, because that's how they're thinking. They're insuring risk, it's changing every year, so they want to know how much reinsurance they should buy for that hurricane season and next hurricane season, etc. So 1% annualized, 2%, whatever it is, the industry's adopted that. But they also stress test their portfolio with scenarios. And they do them large and they do them small. But that's another way that they can actually look at their portfolio and look at its performance for particular events. So I think a tool that allows us to do both would be really helpful. For policymaking, it's just a lot easier to begin to talk about a scenario because you can begin to see all the interconnections and the interdependencies. And you can talk about what it means to people's lives, you can talk about emergency response, you can talk about restoration, and people can actually visualize, feel what it means, what this particular event means. You can't have that same kind of policy discussion only talking about probabilities.
So you notice we're at time, and the new peer director's standing up either to ask a question or to tell us to wrap it up.
I thought to ask a question. John brought up the modeling.
Grace, do you have to ask permission of the director?
I'll make it short. So
Oh, the question, the answer is the problem.
it will be shorter. So I learned quite a bit from the Ford presentation about decision support tools and more. The big takeaway I have from this is how complex the interdependency can be in achieving the resiliency. So the question I have, and has to do also with what John said, should, from a research point of view, we be thinking of different framework of models? Is it enough just to make them probabilistic? Or they should be adaptive in the sense that when new data come in, they should incorporate that. And more importantly, when this interdependency evolves with time, these models should also evolve with time. And this is not just a matter of reducing sensitivity or reducing uncertainty. It's actually addressing this coupling effect between these models. So it's not anymore handing the model from one level to the other, because this coupling effect is probably the key issue. And that can only be learned with data or with more understanding of the interdependency. So your thought would be great.
Short answer for me, yes.
Yeah.
And
I
I'll
will
ask Steve, how are we going to do that?
Well, I would answer all of them. The short answer is yes, but I think that the point you made at the end is really important. As opposed to the kind of handoff that we've been doing in peer from one discipline to the other, I think we have to see a better integration of working together between the disciplines. This is harder. We have to learn each other's language. We have to learn each other's models. But I think that's where we will start to see some new breakthroughs. I think bringing together, as David Lallement did, this growth model with the fragility models is really significant. And he had to go out and learn how to do that. It wasn't easy. He got kind of pushed and beat up and told to get it together and figure it out. But that's what it took. And I think we can't just push our students out to be doing that. We need to do it too.
And I'll just add one thing to what Mary said, and harken back to something Laurie mentioned in her presentation, is about data and how much data do we actually need. One of the things that I think we need to be doing is to look very quickly at the interconnections between the physical and the social environment, and to look at what those impacts are on the social systems. How we do that is a good question. There are a number of ways of approaching it, and there are people that are working on data analytics, they're working on network systems models, and things like that. But that's a question that we'll be kind of wrestling with over the next few years.
And for us over the next few days. So thank you again, everybody, for your attention. And I guess what happens now? We have a short break or
We'll
a
break
break?
until 10:45.
Okay, so great. Grab some more coffee drinks, and we'll keep the discussion going. Thank you again.